My apologies for this morning. But you know, the Holy Spirit is a great disruptor, and He can rearrange the schedule to serve His purposes. So here I am, trying not to be intimidated by being sandwiched between two such great and seasoned teachers as Norm Close and Glenn Schultz. But I'll give it my best shot. So here I go. So I'm going to be talking about discerning the grace and authority of an apostle. And you all know, right, that I'm married to an apostle. Yes, Phil Spence. Stating the obvious. But see, what this means is that I live with an apostle day to day. I see him in all his humanity. You know, we have all our meals together. We work together. We minister together. So I'm with him all the time. And it's actually a great model for how the early church functioned, because they didn't just have their apostles just, you know, swan in and deliver a great message and then hide in the green room until everyone went away. You know, no, they had meals together. They did life together. You know, the early church would have been intimately familiar with their apostles. They would have known their personal struggles, because every human has personal struggles. And so this is a really important thing to think about, because the early church were familiar with their apostles, and yet they still managed to receive from their apostles, because they were able to discern the grace that the apostles were carrying. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Because, you know, apostle, let's start talking about what an apostle is and what an apostle isn't. Because an apostle is not a qualification. Like, if you see a bachelor of apostleship, go ahead and do it. But when you graduate, don't expect to be an apostle, because that's not how it happens, right? It's also not a title. You know, Phil doesn't come up and shake your hand and say, "Hello, I'm Apostle Phil Spence." He doesn't. He says, "Hello, I'm Phil." And, you know, none of his books have down the bottom, written by Apostle Phil Spence. No, because he always wants to remember that apostle is not a title, it's a function and a responsibility. You know, before we're born, the word says God decides how we're going to serve him. He decided that, you know, an apostle was going to be an apostle before they were in their mother's womb, right? But when, you know, say example when Phil was born, the nurse didn't hold him up and say to his parents, "Congratulations, you have a healthy baby boy apostle." No. Because that's not how it happens, right? In fact, he didn't function as an apostle for many years. You know, he grew into a man. He built a very successful ministry. He led a lot of people to the Lord. He helped plant many, many churches. But guess what? Still not an apostle. In fact, he didn't become an apostle until after he gave all of that away. You know, we've all heard the story that God told him one time, "I want you to become nothing and nobody," at the peak of his ministry. You know, the calendar booked a year ahead. People laughing at him, saying, "Everybody knows who you are." But God has his way. And after Phil was obedient and he humbled himself before God, Jesus commissioned him as an apostle, because that's how it happens. You see, Jesus is the apostle. And God gave him the authority to appoint apostles. And that's the only way it happens. They're not self-made. They're predestined and they're commissioned. So this means then, it's a spiritual thing, right? So to discern an apostle's grace, you have to discern them in the Spirit. That's the key. The grace comes from God. Apostles function according to the leading of the Holy Spirit. And that's what we need to be aware of. Paul wrote a lot, pretty much in everything he wrote, that by the grace of God, he was who he was. Grace is spiritual, and it's the power at work in all of us to function in how God designed us to be. So this is true across the board. It doesn't matter if you're fivefold or not. whatever God has destined for us to be is by His grace and no other way.
Yeah.
So the second key to understanding the function of an apostle. I think I already said that bit. See, I'm green. Okay, just bear with me. Now, he appoints individuals to carry apostleship on his behalf. That says in Galatians 1:1 and on. Their job is to be a part of the foundation that has Christ as the chief cornerstone. So this is also important to understand what their function is. If you have a building with a faulty foundation, it will fall down sooner or later. So apostles have the responsibility of making sure the foundation stays strong. And they do that in lots of different ways, but I'm going to focus on 3 ways. And through talking about these 3 ways, I'm going to talk about how you discern the grace that they flow in. So the first one is they teach. Paul wrote that he was set apart for the gospel. He also said he was appointed as a herald and an apostle, as a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. Now, Phil teaches School of the Kingdom through a video series, and we film that in our lounge room in front of my bookcase. And I sit behind the camera for each of those sessions because Phil teaches best to an audience, even if it's one. And I can clearly see when he departs from what he's got on the sheet. Right? And this is the thing with apostles is that they get fresh revelation and then they just flow in that fresh revelation. They can't help themselves. And so there's a shift that happens. You can see he becomes more animated and he just he gets excited because as he's receiving it, he's learning and receiving and then he's passing it on. So he receives the now word from God. For us, our job is to receive it. So we have to always be alert in the Spirit, just like He is to receive it, so that we can receive it from Him. Secondly, they strategize. I remember a trip that we took to Fiji, and it was after the conference. We were sitting around the table having dinner. Penioni was there, Seriana was there, I think Grace was there as well, and we were all talking about what happened during the conference, and then something shifted, and I could see that Phil, he got kind of more intense. He sat up a bit straighter, he leant forward, he got more intense in what he was saying. If I'd missed it, the Holy Spirit made sure I knew, because the Holy Spirit said, okay, you could be quiet now. Stop talking. Because what he was doing was, he was giving strategy that he then passed on to Penioni for the movement. And I could tell that Penioni was receiving it. It was a very intense moment. I actually talked to Phil about it later, and I said how this happened and how the Holy Spirit basically said, be quiet. Because the big people are talking now. Joking. But he did say be quiet. Phil wasn't even aware of it. Right? Because he just flows in it. It's just he's always aware of the Spirit. He's always listening to the Spirit. So he doesn't necessarily know that it's happening. But it can happen at any time. This is the whole point, right? I live with him. Sometimes over breakfast, we'll just have a conversation and all of a sudden it starts flowing, right? That can happen for you. He can be on a phone call with you. He can just catch up with you after a meeting and you'll be talking and it just starts flowing. I mean, we saw it flowing last night, right? Who didn't see that? There is something not quite so nice that they do, which is they correct. But it's very necessary, right? But here's the great thing. Because it's Spirit-led and because God knows our heart, the correction is always just the right amount. Never too light, never too heavy, just right. We see an example of this in the early church. As familiar as everyone was with the Apostle Peter, Ananias and Sapphira thought that they could get away with lying to him. And it was a very serious thing that they did. It could have destabilized the unity of the church in Jerusalem. And as a result, they just both fell down dead, one after the other. The authority at its peak. I never want to go there. So apostles teach, they strategize, and they correct. And it's very important, if we're to receive from an apostle, that we can discern when they're starting to flow and function in that apostolic grace. It's always spiritual, so it's spiritually discerned. And it always functions to build and preserve the unity of the body in the bond of peace. You know, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 40 and 41, it says, "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward, and he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward." Now, name, in the original language, which I was going to attempt to pronounce, thinks onoma. According to the Hebrew notion, the name is inseparable from the person to whom it belongs, as in it's a part of their very essence. If apostles then carried grace and authority as from our chief apostle, Jesus, then the name of the apostle is all of that. Okay? So we could say then, according to Matthew 10:41, that he who receives an apostle in the grace and authority of an apostle shall receive an apostle's reward. So God places apostolic rewards for us in his apostles. You get that? And when we receive them, perceiving the grace that they carry, we position ourselves to receive every blessing God has placed for us in there. The apostles James, Peter and John perceived the grace that had been given to Paul in Galatians 2:9. God makes it clear to those who are ready to see. Apostles are the proton members of the body. They're not separate from the body, but are functioning part of the body. They can be very familiar to us in the natural, but in the things of the Spirit, we're wise to be alert to receive the apostle when he speaks as the apostle, and then we will receive the apostle's reward. Thank you.